Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I too rise to make some comments to the Veterans Affairs Legislation Amendment Omnibus Bill of 2017. I'd just like to start off by acknowledging the work of the ex-service organisations who come out time and again to committee processes within the Parliament to represent the interests of their members, being those people who have served and also their families. And as Senator Whish-Wilson said, the price that is paid by servicemen and women is not just the time away from home, the threat they face, or the physical injuries, but also the mental scars that some bear, and particularly the impact on families. And it is a huge task that DVA has, but it is one that no side of politics ever should, and I don't believe ever has, shirked from seeking to get right. The fact that it is not perfect isn't a reflection on the fact that anyone here doesn't care. It's a reflection of the scale of the task, the changing environment, and whilst there are both processes and other things that we can improve, I just want to acknowledge that from the ESOs to people in this place, and even to DVA, and in fact I'd particularly say to Mr Simon Lewis, who is the current Secretary, there is an awful lot of goodwill on behalf of people who want to put in place processes and mechanisms to make sure that people who have served this nation, when they come back, receive the support that they need. However, it is not yet 100%, perhaps it never will be, but that is no reason for us to never give up seeking to make it as good as we possibly can. And this bill is just the next step in trying to find those processes. It has been through the committee process, and I recognise, Mr Acting Deputy President, that you are the Deputy Chair of the Legislation Committee that considered this, along with myself and Senator Whish-Wilson and others, and we did hear from a range of people who had different views on the bill at hand. So I will just run through some of the key points in the bill and then talk a little bit about some of the concerns that were raised during the committee process, where the government's got to on that, and then a little more broadly on the task, I think, facing DVA and this Australian Parliament as we seek to support those who have served, indeed those who are serving, those in transition and those who have served some time ago. So to the bill, Schedule 1 of the Omnibus Bill looks to amend the Veterans Entitlement Act, and it's seeking to modernise and align the Veterans Review Board operations with those of the Administrative Appeals Tribunals. And that follows the amendments that were made to the Tribunals Amalgamation Act in 2015. They also support an alternative dispute resolution process and recent amendments to the Military Rehabilitation and Compensation Act of 2004, which provide for a single appeal path for reconsidering decisions. Schedule 2 would amend the provisions of the Veterans Entitlement Act of 1986 concerning the Specialist Medical Review Council to improve the operation of the SMRC and streamline some of the SMRC's administrative arrangements and better reflect the manner in which its functions and processes have evolved over time. The proposed amendments would simplify the nomination and appointment process for councillors, enable online lodgement of claims, streamline the notice of investigation requirements and gives the SMRC an ability to pay the travel costs of applicants who appear before oral hearing of the SMRC. In Schedule 3, the proposed amendments would enable international agreements to be made that would cover allied veterans and Defence Force members with the type of service for which benefits and payments, including rehabilitation, can be provided by the Repatriation Commission or the Military Rehabilitation and Compensation Commission under the relevant acts. Currently, the Minister for Veterans Affairs can only enter into arrangements with the governments of countries that are or have been dominions of the Crown. These amendments would enable the Minister for Veterans Affairs to enter into arrangements with a broader range of countries, which reflects the broader range of commitments that Australia has and the places where the men and women of the ADF have served. In Schedule 4, the amendments are intended to clarify that vocational rehabilitation assistance under an employer incentive scheme in the form of wage incentive payments are within the scope of the enabling provisions of the relevant legislation. Proposed amendments in Schedule 5 would amend the Military Rehabilitation Compensation Act 2004 and subsection 151A1 of the Safety Rehabilitation Compensation Defence-Related Claims Act of 1988 to add the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation as a person to whom the Military Rehabilitation and Compensation Commission may provide information for the purposes allowed under the legislation. And the proposed amendments would implement a recommendation by the 2011 review of military compensation arrangements intended to improve the information sharing framework for incapacity and superannuation benefits between the DVA and CSC, and thereby reduce the time taken to process claims by DVA and CSC, which would better support injured former ADF members. In addition, enabling the CSC to use medical information reports held by the MRCC to determine the superannuation claims would also avoid the need to send ADF members for further medical assessment, where DVA already holds the relevant medical evidence that could be used by the CSC to determine superannuation benefits. This also means that ADF members would be spared from the sometimes trauma of having to retell their stories. And this is particularly significant for ADF members who suffer psychological conditions, including those that have arisen as a result of physical or psychological abuse. And both through this Senate Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, but also the work done by the Joint Standing Committee, which I currently chair, we have heard constant stories by members about some of the inefficiencies in the system that do mean they need to engage with multiple agencies, retell their story multiple times, and particularly those who have suffered injuries, some blast injuries that affect, in terms of brain injury, some who are suffering from mental health problems. Those can be very difficult experiences, and anything we can do to minimise that would be well and truly welcome. So during the committee hearings, we heard from a range of witnesses that broadly supported the intent of the bill, although when it came to Schedules 1 and 5, there were a number of concerns raised by people. The committee, though, did hear evidence from the principal member of the Veterans Review Board and from officers of the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation and DVA in response to the concerns. And I would have to say I personally, and the committee in its report, were satisfied that the concerns that had been raised by members of the ESOs and other submitters to the committee had been adequately addressed by the principal member of the VRB, which was Mr Humphreys. The committee notes, and we agreed with Mr Humphreys' evidence, that there be no delegation of the proposed dismissal power, and we felt that was an important step in providing assurance to people who were concerned about how that ability to dismiss claims that were seen as vexatious or frivolous may be dealt with. In Schedule 5, there were concerns raised around privacy, but we have been encouraged by the rapid response of the government and DVA to work by commissioning an independent privacy impact assessment from the Australian Government Solicitor. These measures mean that we will be putting in place the kind of processes to protect the privacy of people, to address the concerns on the one hand, while on the other hand providing the framework and the authority to share information that will actually go some way to reducing the need to retell stories or the delays in terms of processing claims. And one of the key things that has been raised over many years across a range of committees is the impact that delays in processing claims have on veterans and their families. The investment by government into the IT infrastructure is a critical part of this whole exercise, and I see that as a package with broadly bipartisan support, we are moving to a point where we are seeing reskilling of people within DVA to have a more focused approach on the veteran, looking more for that case-managed approach where there are complex needs to reduce the need to deal with different people on multiple occasions. So there is a point of contact to work with a veteran and their family to carry a case forward. And that's been an important step because some of the stories we have heard about the multiple handling of claims, but also in some cases the lack of understanding or empathy on the part of someone in DVA about what a veteran has been through, even the terminology or words used to describe what's occurred in their service history that haven't been understood, and poor decisions have been made in the past. And I'm assured by speaking with Mr Lewis around the type of training that is being provided to staff within DVA that we are getting on top of that. The commitment to the investment in the IT infrastructure, though, is critical to continue, not only to give effect to some of the legislative framework being proposed in this Omnibus bill, but just on practical terms, where for many years there have been delays because of the handling of paper files that have physically had to move between locations within DVA, including even interstate, which has led to, in worst case, loss of information, but in many cases delays. So the concept of moving to a digital platform that will enable the processing in a far more timely manner, the lack of replication of input from the veteran, but also increasingly the ability for a veteran to interface with DVA and the claims process in a digital form so that you can hopefully get to the point where we achieve with DVA what we see in the commercial marketplace, where essentially you can log a claim on your smartphone and within certain parameters have it approved and payments going to accounts almost immediately, as opposed to a long drawn-out process which often puts people who may already be under financial stress in a situation of waiting long periods of time for reimbursement for costs that they have incurred. It's particularly important in terms of that cost base to note that while we have provided no claim, free and immediate medical treatment, all of the associated costs in terms of accessing that treatment also need to be expedited to support the veteran. The last part in terms of the broader package of what the government is providing is indeed to work with the ESOs. One of the frequent comments that's been made to me is that the advocates within the ESOs, whilst there has been the best funding in the past to provide training to support those people, ESOs are telling me it's an ageing workforce. The people who are doing it have been doing it on a largely voluntary basis for many years. In many cases, ESOs have struggled to recruit new people to replace those who are getting to the point where they perhaps need to pull back from that activity. And the whole concept of how we provide that support to our veteran community, particularly when the consequences of the success of a claim are quite critical in the financial future for a veteran and their family, providing a mechanism to select and then train and support advocates is important. Personally, and I've put this forward in inquiries, I believe there is a real case for these to actually move, in some cases, to a salaried position funded by DVA, where people, particularly if they come from a service background, perhaps get training, whether it's in legal areas or in areas of things like financial planning, so that they can provide detailed, informed advice to veterans who have complex cases. And there's some work occurring, starting off with an audit last year of the full range of ESOs to understand who's out there, who's doing what. And I think that being able to work together to find a framework where we can equip those people who want to help them to raise the level of training and competence to provide agreed levels of service, but then having these people who are available to provide specialist help for more complex cases is what we need to look at as we move into the future. Because whilst we have around 58,000 people currently serving, the reality is DVA currently supports around 290,000 Australians. So there are a lot of people who rely on the efficacy of the systems and the training of the people within DVA. Of that, some 82,000 are widows or widowers, and around 2,500 are children of veterans. And so there are a large number of people who are, to a certain extent, particularly when you consider the age, more than 203,000 of DVA's clients are over 65. They rely on the system functioning well. Particularly though, the focus of this bill and a lot of the current work is looking at that cohort who are leaving Defence in that transition process out into the civilian workforce. And I think it's important to acknowledge that for many who serve in Defence, and after 23 years I transitioned out of into Defence into a different career, and I've been blessed. I've never had to reach back to DVA, and for many people that transition is seamless and they move on to fulfilling careers without ever having to reach back. But that's not the case for all, and for those who need it, the support needs to be there and it needs to be effective. So this Omnibus bill is trying to wrap up a number of measures within DVA. It's enabling legislation and the way that the review and appeal processes work so that we get quicker claims to the benefit of the veteran, and for that reason I will be supporting the bill.
Thank you, Senator Fawcett.